Good morning. Today's session deals with publishing at the Library of Congress. Our speaker is Dana Pratt, Director of Publishing here at the library since 1978. Previously, he was Assistant Director of Yale University Press, where he had both managerial and editorial responsibilities. Mr. Pratt began his publishing career first selling Princeton University Press titles and then managing sales for the University of Illinois Press. In 1955, he became a field consultant for Franklin Book Program, which was founded to promote indigenous publishing in developing countries. 4 years later, he joined the American Book Publishing Council, one of the predecessor organizations of the AAP, as a staff associate. And in 1962, he was appointed as the first executive secretary of the American Association of University Presses and managing director of its subsidiary, American University Press Services, Inc. Please welcome Mr. Pratt.
Good morning. I'm going to make this pretty much a show and tell. And secondly, since I don't have a prepared speech, but instead notes, I would suggest that you interrupt at any time. Feel free, because that isn't to say you have to ask questions. You can sit there and not ask any questions. That's okay with me. But feel free to ask them at any time. Publishing at the Library of Congress, I like to say, began in 1801. And I will explain why I make that assertion. In 1800, the committee that gathered to consider the need for a library and put it through Congress, because Congress was now established in Washington and needed some books to refer to. That committee sent an order for several hundred books to a London bookseller, Cadell and Davies. And that bookseller was a responsible agent for the young nation and filled the order promptly, packing them in what were called hair trunks. Those are trunks made out of hide with the fur on the hide. I don't know why they made them that way in those days, but they did. And the bookseller said, we've shipped the books this way for you because we thought you might like to reuse those trunks. So they were very efficient. Sent with this shipment an invoice saying what they were shipping. The books arrived in Baltimore and were transported to the new city of Washington very successfully and were subsequently shelved. And later cataloged, but the first list of this new library was in fact a printing of the invoice from Cadell and Davies with the covering letter from Cadell and Davies. I first called this document the first catalog of the Library of Congress and was promptly told by John Cole that I was using the word incorrectly, that this was simply a checklist, and it did not deserve the august term catalog. I therefore retreated from that, made a terminological retreat, and called it the first checklist of the Library of Congress. And also, as I say, I assert that it is the first publication. I think it's not stretching the truth at all too far to say that that's so. What we did in honor of that first publication was to produce a facsimile of it. And it carries, well, it's the same title, the first book list of the Library of Congress. And it carries a brief foreword and an exact facsimile of the pamphlet itself that was produced in 1801 by a rather sloppy printer, I must say. He was not exactly your ace printer at that time. The paper on which it was printed was also not very good, so we made no attempt to replicate the paper as it is now because it's kind of discolored. We used the copy in the rare book division. Instead, we used paper of a sort that probably would have been used at that time. So the facsimile is a facsimile in the sense of picking up the type exactly, but not the present condition of the paper. This is it. Same size, same everything. It's an interesting list. It includes not only books, but a few maps. And they were rather sober, serious, useful books. Later, the Library of Congress started producing genuine catalogs, of which the 1812 catalog is an important and interesting one because it was the catalog of the collection that then was torched by the British when they came to the capital and did their foul deeds. There's even now some speculation as to really how many books were destroyed in that episode, but it was a very large number of the then Library of Congress. There is also the speculation that the lieutenant in charge of the detail that stormed the Capitol was such an intellectual that he decided to burn the Library of Congress because he realized it was too narrowly focused and ought to be replaced by something much better. That canard can be beaten back by a study of the 1812 catalog. And there's an awful lot of kind of assumptions made about the books of the Library of Congress at that time. The assumption that they were very narrow, super lawyerly, and not very broad and liberal in their spread. An examination of that 1812 catalog leads one to a somewhat different conclusion. We have brought out a facsimile of that catalog, which I should have brought with me. At any rate, that catalog carries with it an introduction by an historian at Virginia who analyzes the library of that time and its intellectual components and does a very good job of it. Plus, there are 3 indexes that are extremely helpful. One is an index that lists the titles as they actually were and not as they were shown in the catalog, because the catalog was fouled up in that respect. There are a number of short titles that would be very difficult to understand unless you did the research that was then done. An index to printers and an index to places. And it's an interesting exercise just to look to see where these books were produced. That catalog is also an important book for political reasons because Senator Baker, his office as Majority Leader of the Senate, occupies the space that probably was occupied by the library that was burned. And there is the hope that he will, in fact, as he said he would like to do, try to raise money to replicate that library in that space. That would take a fair amount of money to do, but he says he wants to do it. In 1904, I'm skipping a few decades, but in 1904, the then great librarian Putnam, Herbert Putnam, made a statement which is worth reading. In my report for 1904, I gave the reasons in favor of the printing by the library of this and of similar unpublished manuscript records in its possession. It would save excessive wear and tear upon the originals. It would enable the texts to be studied by investigators who cannot come to Washington, and it would encourage that thorough, detailed, and continuing study of them which their value and interest and a proper understanding of American history require. He was referring to the records of the Virginia Company, one of the great collections in the manuscript division. And those records were published at a rather leisurely pace from 1906 to 1932. They did not hurry, but it was a very fine publishing effort that was made. I will show you later a facsimile which responds directly to Putnam's statement, but probably in a way where he might not have anticipated. Another great publishing achievement in the past, although in this case the more recent past, was the publication in 1952 of a magisterial 4-volume catalog of the library of Thomas Jefferson. It was done by a very peppy, from what I understand, Englishwoman, Millicent Sowerby, who simply went to work and did the whole damn thing. And it's an extraordinary job of recording every book that was in Jefferson's library that he gave to the Library of Congress, and giving the origin of the book, the circumstances of the purchase, some speculation as to why the book was bought, and it becomes, therefore, a biobibliography. It is so important that, although it went out of print some years ago, I'm happy to say that University of Virginia Press, with the aid of a foundation, is going to bring out a reprint of that catalog. So it will continue to be available starting, I suppose, later this year when they do the reprinting. I'll come to the present now. We now, when I say we, this is the publishing office of the Library of Congress, and make that point because there's a lot of publishing that goes on elsewhere, not least of which is what Joe Ross does at Copyright, and there's the publishing at CDS and Division. Let me take up here with telling you a little bit about the publishing office, where we are and what we do. That is, besides showing you the books we've done. We bring out about 25 to 30 books a year. In addition to that, we work with, for example, CRS and CDS in certain projects in which we help them with getting production done. But the books that we are responsible for completely number about 25 to 30 a year. We have a staff of 11. We're located on this floor, room 604. Drop in. And if you have some ideas for books, particularly drop in. I should have said that we do depend on our colleagues for ideas for books and for the books themselves, because virtually all of what we do is done by people at the library. Once in a while we do commission, as we did commission this guide. But the preponderant number of manuscripts we produce are done by the library people themselves. That raises a copyright question, which I'll get to in a minute, I promise, and particularly in this forum. The staff of 11 includes myself, and then we have a chief editor and 3 editors under him, production manager, assistant production manager, chief typographer, and 2 secretaries. I hope that adds up to 11. We have 2 budgets. The very much the larger budget is the one of appropriated funds that we use for production of books via GPO. I'll try to give you a painless, though boring, but brief explanation of economics of publishing in the federal government. Believe me, it was all new to me when I came here, because when I came from Yale, which is a freestanding operation, and you have something called a balance sheet, and you have operating statements, and you're supposed to meet expenses, it's all, with sales, that is to say, it's all very different here. The budget we have pays for the upfront costs of a book, by which I mean, another word is front-end costs. In other words, the one-time costs, the composition, separations, plate making, things that have to be done whether you're printing one copy or 100,000 copies. It pays for those costs plus those copies that the library wants to have for its own administrative and gift and exchange uses. We cannot sell any books from the appropriated side. So that, for example, the Madison book, there was a particular reason for having a lot of copies because of the whole business of the dedication of the Memorial Hall. We produced for our own use 1,000 copies. Superintendent of Documents rode on that printing. If you can sort of visualize, supposing you get this book on press, we have paid all the costs up to that point. The press rolls. Out come 1,000 copies. We've still paid all those costs. But with copy 1001, the Superintendent of Documents starts to pay. He pays for the copies that are going to go to the depository libraries, and those copies are paid for out of a special congressional appropriation. He also pays for the copies that he's going to put on sale. Those copies he pays for out of his fund, which is risk capital against the prospect of sale. So the print order is made up of three parts: what we need, what the depository libraries need, and what the Superintendent of Documents needs. What I have never been able to get used to is that we pay, but we don't get a damn thing back. The sales that are made by the Superintendent of Documents, that income goes entirely to him, it. That's simply the way it is. Reason, and I can understand it, even though it's so very different from what I'm used to. The reason is that it would be chaotic for each federal agency to have its own system for production, distribution, accounting for sales, and all the rest of it. It would be a hopeless duplication of effort. The theory is that there should be a single organization that would handle all of that. The practice is flawed from time to time, but the theory is a good one. The theory, furthermore, and the practice is that the Superintendent of Documents buys for its own account those books that it sells. Hence, we really cannot expect to receive anything back. I suppose if you look at it from a bird's eye view, there's kind of a wash going on among all of the accounts in the government. But the money we spend because it is one of the missions of the Library of Congress is to publish books. And that is the budget we use. It's up to us not to overspend that budget. And we have to be careful with estimates of costs and so forth to see how we're doing. I mentioned copyright. I better speak to that point for a moment before I forget to. I have come across the copyright question a few times and for various reasons here, and have learned more about work for hire than I knew before. And it is now my understanding that if a work is produced, let me skip work for hire for a moment. If a work is produced by one of us, you or you or you, on company time, and is published by the company, which is to say the Library of Congress, you receive nothing except your salary. You have done this as part of your job. You don't get anything more than that. Nor is there a copyright, because it has been produced from within a government agency on government time and is therefore in the public domain and can be ripped off, as some of our books have been. It is totally legal. One very embarrassing case, before my time I would say, was what could have been a very handsome book called Viewpoints, with a lot of illustrations showing the kinds of things you could get in the Prints and Photographs division. That book was produced by GPO at about the quality you would expect from a junior high school printing shop. It was lousy. It still sold a lot of copies. Arno Press in New York made a printing of that book, totally legal, and it came out much better. The quality was much better. If a manuscript is produced on contract, that is to say, work for hire, well, when I'm around copyright people, I have to be careful what I'm saying. If it is produced on contract, I'll get to work for hire in a moment, you then have a different situation. If the contract with that outside author says that it is work for hire, then the Library of Congress may copyright that. If, on the other hand, nothing is said, if the words work for hire do not appear, the presumption is that the copyright resides with the author with whom you've contracted, which may be what you want, but it's better to spell it out. We are involved with precisely that question with the American Cowboy book, which consists of a group of essays as well as a whole lot of illustrations, and these essays were commissioned. In 4 out of 5 of the cases, it says work for hire. In the 5th case, it does not. So we have to rearrange things in such a way that the ultimate result is that the book will bear a copyright that says, C in a circle, Library of Congress, 1983, and that's all it says, rather than having a bunch of copyrights in the names of each of the authors. I have found with this aspect of copyright, as with every other aspect of copyright, and I've known something about it because everybody must know about it in publishing, the more you know, the more you don't know. That's my slogan for today about copyright. Very damn complicated. Very interesting, but complicated. There's an almost Talmudic lore to the whole thing. It's so, but fascinating. On the private side, very, very small, but we can really move with what we have on the private side because we don't have to go through GPO. And Joe Ross will bear me out, and I won't go into details, but working with GPO has its own charm. It takes a lot of work. On the private side, we have a revolving fund, which we try to keep revolving with income, and it has that nice characteristic, which is when you sell something, you get the money back into the fund that you paid for it with. And this is called the CLAP fund. The cost of commissioning the authorship of this book, the cost of producing it, designing and producing it, was paid for entirely from the CLAP fund. So all of the sales receipts go back into it. Basically, what happens is that the profits we make on the greeting cards that are also produced from the CLAP fund go into such projects as the guide to the Library of Congress or this book. I hope you have all seen and grabbed a copy of this sterling catalog, card and gift catalog. No? Yes? It's at the sales shop, and you should always be sure to get a copy around October, because this will solve your greeting card problems. Great stuff, and buy them and you'll know you're supporting a useful activity. But more than that, they're good-looking cards, and they're all derived from the collections of the Library of Congress. This first assortment package here of flowers done by Pierre-Joseph Redouté, that has sold out totally. We've had to reprint, which is really nice. The publishing process is, to a lot of people, laymen, that is, sort of a black box. Something called a manuscript goes in one end of the box, and later on, usually much too much later on, out comes at the other end something called a book. And I'll just tell you just a little bit about the black box to at least sort out the compartments in that box. When the manuscript comes in, it has to be edited. There are, oversimplifying it, two kinds of editing that might happen. One kind is that the manuscript is too long, too short, too wide, too high, too something which requires some cutting or adding or transposition. That kind of editing is at one level. At another level is the editing that is called copy editing. And that is a very important kind of editing. What it is simply to go through line by line and make sure that the style is consistent, that if you've called somebody, well, supposing if you have a word, a person's name spelled S-C-H-R-O umlaut D-E-R, Schroeder, that it stays that way and doesn't turn into S-C-H-R-O-E-D-E-R 100 pages later. It's that kind of search for consistency, making sure the footnotes are okay, making sure the bibliography follows the Library of Congress style, and boy, if it doesn't, do we ever hear about it. Publishing from the Library of Congress imposes particular obligations about bibliography, for example, and about accuracy generally, because I think we're thought to be inaccurate, as though that thought may be. We're thought to be in the outside world as being very precise, and we have the word. And if the word goes out and it's misspelled, not nice. So the copy editing is very important. Once that's done, the book is to be designed, and that is an art that requires a particular eye and an understanding of production, an understanding of what the book is intended to do, who it's for. And we've been fortunate in working with designers who have that gift. This, I'll give you an example of the criteria that I would point out in this book. This was designed by a woman in Philadelphia, Adrienne Dudden, who has had a career of designing books in art history. These books have a particular kind of challenge. What she was able to do was to maintain a certain scale among the illustrations so that you wouldn't have something that really was in real life this big, looking this big compared to something else that was really big, looking that big. There had to be a rough ratio of sizes. Furthermore, the illustrations should be on the same page as the text if possible. And third, there should be a good pace. She's achieved all of those objectives admirably. Finally, there is the production. It requires a production manager, and we have such a person who is very, very meticulous in seeing to it that all of the components of the book are being put through the process of production properly, and all the more so when it means dealing with GPO, because you are then at one remove from the printer, and that's the agonizing thing of working with GPO. You're not dealing directly with the printer. You're dealing with an organization that in turn deals with the printer. In publishing, I think one of your previous speakers said, show me not the glamour of publishing, I'll tell you about the details. My remark is that I will quote Admiral Rickover, who I would not ordinarily quote, but Admiral Rickover said, and this was in connection with building submarines, the devil is in the details. And that is certainly true. Much of what goes on in publishing is a relentless attention to detail, an extraordinary application of effort, of which I am not capable myself. I am myself a dilettante. And one of the few professions where you can get paid for being a dilettante is publishing. I'm the dilettante. The people who work at the publishing office are the ones who work on those goddamn details. There is, however, there can be, however, an over-attention to details, and I'm sorry to say that at the Library of Congress there is a considerable over-attention to detail, an unwillingness at times to release anything for fear that it might have something wrong, an unwillingness on the part of a bibliographer to release the bibliography for fear there might be another item over the next hill. You laugh, it's true. We have a bibliography coming up, and I will spare the name of the person. It was a dear friend, but we have told such person and given that person a deadline of a particular day next summer. Horror! That soon? And this person has been working on the bibliography for the last 5 years. There has to come a time when you stop already and just say, okay, stop. I'm familiar with the problem of that kind of it's almost, can't think of the word, being overzealous. And I'll tell you a quick story from my days at Yale Press. There was an extraordinary person, in fact he teaches at the University of Maryland and lives in Washington, who came upon a vast number of letters of a Civil War family in Georgia. Conceived the idea that those letters could be arranged in a way as to present what he called an epistolary novel, all true, but arranged in such a way that it would tell the story of the Jones family from before, during, and after the Civil War. He went to 7 or 8 publishers, all of whom were absolutely aghast at the size of the manuscript. He came to Yale University Press. We too were aghast, but we did not reject it. There are times I wish we had rejected it. One of his less admirable traits was that he was usually right. For example, he said, we should make this in one volume. We said, there's no way this couldn't go in one volume. And he said, yes, there is. And he proceeded to show us a half a dozen examples of how it could be done. We ended up printing it. I'm getting ahead of the story. So one of his many difficult traits was, though, that he could not let go. And to the point where he was really, and I mean this literally, inspecting the third set of proofs with a magnifying glass because there were broken E's, and he had to find every damn one of them and circle them and say, reset. If you keep doing that, you will never stop, because you will just want another set of proofs. And it simply got out of control. It was clear that he was in a state where he could not let this baby go out into the world. So we summoned him to New Haven from Washington, and I shall never forget this meeting, because Robert Manson Myers and the director of the press and the editor-in-chief and I sat around this table, and it was a very grim occasion. And I was saying nothing. The conversation was going back and forth, and the director said, you may not go any further. You are not to see anything more, no more checking proofs. This is it. What you will see next is the finished book. And this was his body language. What if I refuse? That's when I pitched in. I said, if you refuse, you are welcome to buy from us the $25,000 worth of paper, which we have already bought, on which we plan to print your book. You may buy that paper for $25,000, and you may go and publish that book. And he said, the book went on to great success. It sold altogether 25,000 copies in various manifestations. It received a National Book Award, but he was never, even when all of that was happening, a satisfied author. Extraordinary man. That's an example of being overzealous with the details. So there has to be some point where you say, stop. I'll tell you one other anecdote, which I've told all over the library. It's hardly new to a lot of people. But I read with fascination a book called The Soul of a New Machine. Any of you read that book? It's an absolutely gripping story about developing a new computer at Data General in Massachusetts. You would be surprised how exciting the story is of building this new machine. The guy in charge of building it reminds me of what a publisher is like. Because this guy was saying, it's my job to get that machine out the door, meaning to the customers. Meanwhile, he had some brilliant engineers who were convinced that it was their job to build an architectonic structure of such engineering beauty as would never be surpassed, and that they had to make every little piece fit in place, and they were going to build bigger and better Chinese puzzles, and please don't stop because we're still building them. That was their position. He realized that if this were going to go on, the machine would never go out the door. So one day he produced a big banner, and I think I'll put it in my office sometime, I'll do my own version. The banner read, "Some things worth doing are not worth doing well." And I tell that story around the library. My colleagues are horrified because the whole mindset is, do it perfectly or don't ever do it. There has to be a certain compromise with reality. I will conclude by showing you what a book looks like when it first comes off press. It just happens that I have something from the American Cowboy, and I'll give you a brief little printing lesson that will be, I hope, enlightening. This, in case you didn't know, is a blank sheet of paper. This is a printed sheet. And it came off press 2 days ago at Garamond Pridemark Press in Baltimore. And is the first sheet off press. We went there for what's called a press inspection to see how it was running. This sheet is printed in 5 colors and was printed on a press made in Germany by Heidelberg that cost $1 million. And I can see why it cost $1 million, because it's a beautiful piece of equipment. And I'll explain a few things here. 4 of the colors are used to produce the illusion of color. And by which I mean that these are the so-called process colors. Blue, red, well, you can see how they seem up here. Blue, red, yellow, the 3 primary colors, and black, which gives a kind of a depth which would otherwise not be achieved. The art in color printing, and it is an art as well as a science, is to try to get on that piece of paper an image which is as close as possible to the original. The original was photographed, and the transparency in every case was brought to the printer, who turned it over to a separation house, which produced these produced separations. I'll explain what they are in a minute. Produced separations with a laser scanner, which is the newest and best way of doing it. The separations are, I'm familiar with how they work in photography, but certainly I don't know how the laser works, so I'll explain, or try to explain how it works in the photographic method. What you do is to put up a filter that will filter out everything except, like, in one case, red. So you put the transparency there, and the filter in front of it subtracts everything except red. The light goes through the transparency and through the filter, and then through a grid of dots, or rather a grid which then can produce dots. Where there's a lot of red, the dot is this big. Where there's not much red, it's this big. Where there's no red, there's no dot. So the dots are of infinitely varying sizes. Then you do it for blue, producing a bunch of blue dots. And the blue dots are arranged in a way which are slightly at an angle from the red. The yellow, it's a different angle. The black, still a different angle. These separations are on film, which are then stripped up, that is, taped together, and it then becomes a very exacting process of producing printing plates that can then run this sheet of paper in such a way that there is perfect registration. And if you're off by a couple of millimeters, the eye will detect that. So there's a tremendous engineering that goes on in the press, and the skill of the pressman to make sure that everything lines up. And what finally happens is that if you put this under a 10-power glass, you can see a kind of rosette of dots. The effect that's produced is sort of an analog to movies. Movies, as you know perfectly well, are simply a series of still images. The illusion of motion is created by the passage of that film and goes shh, like that. Here the illusion is caused by this grouping of these dots, which you cannot see with the naked eye, but which together impose on the retina this illusion of kind of a infinite gradation of color. It's a great process. Now, the other thing I would mention is, what is the fifth color? The fifth color is a brownish black. And the reason for that brownish black is to produce what's called a duotone in the photographs. These photographs of that time were printed in such a way that they were not black. They were sort of brownish black. So what you do here is to have the black set of black dots and then a set of brown dots, which together produce this very kind of warm shade. And the book will have it all the way through, color as well as duotone. I'll leave this here, you can take a look at it. Well, that's all I had on my agenda, and be glad to have more questions, or you can gather around and look at that sheet, whichever you like to do. Yeah.
When you work with GPO, how much of the publication you have, production you have completed? Do you have all the layout done, everything at that point? Or?
Yeah. We go in two ways. Sometimes we will go to them with the marked manuscript and say, take it from there, and they then put out the typesetting on bid. We get the galleys, and then it goes on and bid for printing, moves on out. On something that has some illustrations, we prefer to get our own mechanicals so that we can control the positioning. Now, this book happens to be entirely on the private side. This is the one that's being supported by United Technologies, which spares no expense. Any question, Mike?
Who determines what to publish? Is there a committee, or do you do it yourself as far as?
We do it. There used to be a committee called the Bibliographical and Publications Committee before my time, and it was abolished largely because it was just not functioning with any particular timeliness. There is, I suppose, a slight danger in not having a committee, because then the decision does reside in our office, and it combines the consideration of the editor and of myself. So one could argue that this is perhaps limiting the authority too much. On the other hand, most of what we publish is of a sort that it's difficult to put out for review. That is, typically a university press will go out for outside readers, the reports will come in, the publications committee will consider the reports, and so on. So much of what we do consists of these catalogs and bibliographies, which are really, you can't send them out and say, what do you think? It's a job being done by people who know how to do it. So the decision is usually to publish. Only rarely have we said this looks so slight, or that the cost would be so great in return for, in terms of what would be achieved. So we haven't said no too often.
What is your normal press run? Larry, or is it?
Well, I've told you about how it consists of three factors. And ordinarily, all those three together would add up to anywhere from 1,000 up to 3,000. Sometimes less, in fact. Yeah, I can think of some bibliographies of very limited sort that would be less.
Why don't you try to do more popular books on your own, such as the Cowboy book? Why is it your own? Why do you generally have somebody else?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because it then relates to the kind of setup we have. We are best at doing books which are obviously Library of Congress books. I don't mean that in any derogatory way, but The Library of Congress is expected to produce catalogs and bibliographies, for example, and by God, we produce them. It's a little less expected to get popular books. And I think that there, either the book should be undertaken by a commercial publisher that can go and reach the popular market, or if we do a book, we should try to lay off copies to a commercial publisher to reach that market. And The American Cowboy is a very good example. This was to be and is a catalog of an exhibit which is entirely from the Library of Congress. It seemed to me from the very, very start that it would have a lot of popular interest. On the private side, we have really no way that we can get to the bookstores for reasons that I can't go into except to say that the Library of Congress is not set up to handle credit, receivables, missed shipments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Booksellers are tough to deal with. So here what we've done is to go to a bunch of publishers, of which Harper & Row was the one that said they wanted to do it. Harper & Row is paying for its own run-on of the catalog. They'll bite it in hardcover, sell it this fall, and the deal includes a royalty to the authors and to the American Folklife Center of the Library of Congress, because the Folklife Center was put together the whole exhibit. So I'm very keen that popular books should be done, but it's important that they be done in a way that will reach the market, because if they don't reach the market, there's no point. And there's no point in publishing for the warehouse. You have to publish for people, and they have to be able to get those books. So Harper will bring out a hardcover edition at a much higher price than the catalog, but it will go into bookstores. Whereas this catalog will be available only at the Library of Congress and only at the museums to which this show travels. So I think it'll make a nice arrangement. Any other questions? Okay, well, I enjoyed being here, and please take a look at this sheet and have a good lunch.